Okay, no, back. You want to move this down? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There.
Yeah, that's all right. All right, now I have to have a disclaimer right up at the very front. There's a very good chance that there will be some glitches in here because I did a sort of a quick scan, but the big problem in preparing this is that I spend too much time reading and thinking and not enough time putting it down. And so I always are coming up against the deadline, and then I've had to deal with medical appointments throughout the week. And so we'll see how it goes. But we're going to go back to where we ended last time and looking at our universe and the forces that come into being at the start of the creation of our universe. And you can see the forces there. There's the four main ones with gravity and then dark energy. And I was just reading something yesterday. This is one of the problems. I start reading stuff like this and not doing my presentation. And they're now saying that some of the theory, the most advanced theory on dark energy has some flaws in it. But the concept, I think, behind dark energy is that it represents the energy that's in that unified field. And that energy, these forces, bring matter into existence. And that matter we call nature. And it also brings, these forces also govern how we interact and how we communicate and how we do the thinking. We tend not to think that the forces that were behind the creation of or the beginning of the universe don't really have anything to do with what's going on in our head. But those same forces that brought the universe into existence are the same forces that are governing our lives and our social interactions, our social communities, and our thinking. And so within this context, we want to look at the principles that lie behind those forces. Those forces are part of this field. They come in and are manifest in a particular way in our universe. Those forces are governed by principles. That's what gives the universe order. That's why there's patterns. That's why everything holds together, is because of the principles. And these principles are discovered through laws. That's what science is about, is trying to understand the nature of those forces. And dialectics is really describing the character of the principles and the laws. And we'll get into the main ones that have been talked about is this idea of the negation of negation. And if we look at that at the beginning of the universe with the cosmic inflation and the Big Bang, what happens, as we discussed last week, was there's a certain energy spike. So we've got this huge spike of negative energy. And in order to bring the field, the unified energy field into equilibrium, that energy has to be negated. That negative energy has to be negated. And that's what leads to the universe. And so right there at the very beginning, the idea of negation of negation. And you think about our lives, we are all in the process of negating the negative. The negative is death. And so we are negating that. All life is negating that negative, that negation. So that's a principle of the universe. Another one of is the unity of opposites. And this is crucial. And this is something that runs through the philosophers that we'll look at. And to look at the unity of opposites, we can look at the quark and the hadron we talked about last time, where you've got opposites, a down quark and an up quark, and they're opposite, but they become unified in the proton. And that unity takes place throughout all of nature. And this is one of the things that's really hard for people to think about, and that is for something to be similar but distinct. We categorize things so much with empirical science that we create boundaries between different matter. And what we don't look at is that everything is a unity. All of chemistry is the unity of opposites. Lenin gave some examples in his work he did on the question of dialectics. So in math, you've got the plus and minus, and that unity leads to differential and integral calculus. Mechanics, action, reaction. In physics, the positive and negative electricity, and then in chemistry, the combination, and then the breaking up of atoms. And then in social science, the class struggle between those who are ruling and those who are ruled. Another big piece of the principle, dialectical principle, is that an increase in quantity brings about a qualitative change. And we see that with the orange, that at each step, the going from the bud, the increase of the quantity in that bud leads to a qualitative transformation into a flower. And all the way through, it's that qualitative transformation. And that's a key piece of reality, and it's one that isn't looked at as much in science, which focuses a lot more on the product and not the process. A concept that I've been thinking about a little bit more is this whole notion of chemical electrical signaling. And this is a key piece of the universe. When those gluons in that proton, there's electrical and chemical signaling that they are doing by their nature. One is negative and one is positive. And that signaling then brings about the unification. We also see this in one-eyed Carrie, in the one cell there. The cell is picking up signals, chemical, electrical, and thermal signals from the environment. those signals then are transduced. If the signals went directly in the cell, it would kill it. They're changed into sort of the language of the organism. Then there's this signaling that's taking place within that cell that then leads to activity. And that activity is again sending signals to the environment. So everything is tied in with this chemical electrical signaling. And it's happening now as energy and sound waves are going into many vacuums. So you've got the sender, the chemical electrical signaling, and then the receiver. The big difference with human beings is when symbols or signs get introduced with meaning through languaging process. This process of using symbolic representation, a symbol that stands for something else, which is a higher level of thinking, it's an abstract level of thinking, is called semiosis. And that's the term you've run into in the readings, semiotic mediation, which sounds like some fancy academic term, but really what it's talking about is this very process of using symbols as a way to communicate. So the semios is the sign, and the mediation, what's being mediated is instead of going straight through the electrical signaling to the sender, it's mediated by a word, and that word has meaning. And so we look through our entire nervous system. This is a glitch where there's information in patterns. And then what happens over time is this information is coming in, and through evolution, the development of the nerves to more effectively get information in develops. And that leads to nerves, a central nervous system. And the first one is this a flatworm, a picture of which is there. So we look at the mouse brain that has 75 million neurons, and these are actually pictures of the neurons within a mouse brain. And so the brain develops because you get more and more information in, and you need sort of a telephone operator to control, to process the signaling faster, and that leads to the brain. The human brain has 86 billion neurons. And this is one of these things where you get a fact in science. Almost every single book you read in neuroscience talking about the brain talks about 100 billion neurons. So this woman, Susana Portulano Rosell, a Brazilian, began asking that question. How do they know that there's 100? And the way they came up with that figure was to take these microscopic slices of the brain and then count how many neurons were in that little slice, and then average that out and say, well, that's how many are in the brain. The big problem with that is that there's different concentrations in different parts of the brain. So what she did was she got a brain and then put it into like a dish water or a washing detergent that then breaks down and releases the neurons, and then in a mass spectrometer, which does it by atomic weight, is able to pull out the neurons. And so even if she's, when she's doing the whole brain that way, she can just take a dropper of these neurons and then extrapolate and have a very accurate count, and came up with that. And she's looked at brains from insects up through the elephant. And so it's an interesting study. There's a project that's based up in Seattle around the Microsoft participants who are funding, one of them is funding it. And they've got people from all over the world creating this human connectome, trying to figure out all of the connections. And they're doing it, and they've created a database that's available to anybody who's doing research on it. But this is just a beginning sort of macro picture. All of these here are showing the neurons. And so what we're really looking at is information's coming in. This energy that's coming in contains information. That information is in patterns. And all organisms then are evolved to take in that information in their particular way, whether it's sight or smell or sound. And so I'm thinking of this concept of a conceptual neuronal network. And if we look at the chemical signaling, there's that which comes from the outside, the exteroception, and then the interoception. And there's another one that's buried in there, proprioception, which is awareness of the sense. So all of these signals are going through your body constantly. And signals are constantly coming in. And then it's how we process those. And we talked last time a little bit about Carrie and sensing and the importance of affect and activity in that sensing, and them developing an awareness of their surroundings and how to interact with it. Then with humans and development of words and meaning, every single word is a concept. And and there's two planes of language, the internal and the external. And I gave a presentation at Penn State, and afterwards went to dinner with somebody who is sort of a big figure, international figure in Vygotsky studies. And I, just in passing in the conversation, said that Vygotsky said that every word is a concept. And he showed that arrogance that's all too familiar for know-it-all academics, the ones who violate or are examples of the mantra I like to use, that the greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. And he certainly had that illusion of knowledge. That fighting against illusion of knowledge is something I have to keep doing myself. So what is a conceptual neuronal network then? Well, all animals have this network. It's when information comes into their brain, it gets processed. And they have, when we think of the word concept, we tend to think of things like democracy or justice, big concepts. Whereas a concept with an animal is that they generalize. So when my black lab sees a stick, they have a concept that this is something that can be retrieved. Pick it up, and so, and then to survive, if the predator's coming in, you have to have a concept that this is bad. There's a built-in part of the conceptual neuronal network is what you've inherited from the parents. And so they have concepts of good and bad. It's not the same concepts we have. It's not human concepts, it's animal concepts. But that's part of this process and what we were endowed with when the qualitative leap takes place. So a key part, and this is something that we'll look at more with the philosophers, is this concept of the brain-mind unity. And generalization is a huge piece of that conceptual network. The brain-mind unity is important because almost all peak neuroscientists are looking, they separate the two out. This is where this unity of opposites comes in, that they study just the brain and go in and look at the neurons and do wonderful work. But then how is it connected? They can't connect it to the mind. They say, oh yeah, it's part of the mind. Then you get people, the philosophers, who sit and ponder big questions, but then they have a very difficult time connecting it to the brain. And you can't study those two things separately and then just hope you put them back together. They have to be looked at as a unity. But the problem is that they're two distinct things. They have to be looked at as one. So this is this notion of distinct yet unified. And that's a hard one for people to understand. Well, for the human conceptual neuronal network, there's a qualitative transformation that takes place. And Vygotsky uses the word signifying, and the difference between signifying and signaling. Signifying means that you're using a sign, you're using semiotic mediation. And this is where that qualitative transformation takes place. And so our conceptual, the human conceptual neuronal network has signifying as a huge piece of it. And we looked at this last time with the natural forces and nature, and looked at languaging and literacy. And that's just a word that I coined just this last week. I had a meeting with one of my favorite doctoral students, but don't tell her that, Beth Grievous Chavez, because all of my doctoral students are my favorite doctoral students. So you're all my favorite students.
And all master students.
And master students, yes, especially master students. And so she's very interested in literacy. And then you think, well, what is literacy? And I know that in your courses, you're going to run into a lot of discussion about what is literacy and critical literacy and reading and writing, but then multiple literacy. And there's the New London group that has their theory on different kinds of literacy and media literacy and that. And I said to her, instead of thinking about literacy as by defining it, what are its origins? Where does literacy come from? And when you start to look at it that way, then instead of taking academic notions, you look at the world and you look at how literacy evolves, develops. And I make a distinction then. Again, we've got the two different planes, and I'll come back to the literacy. There's these two planes, the internal, so you think of the internal conceptual neuronal network. Every single one of you has your own conceptual neuronal network that was given to you by the process that started with the one cell and came up through human evolution and then social interaction and your parents. So you're born with it, and it starts developing in utero. And then once born, you get all of this information that's coming in. That all gets processed and becomes part of your neuronal network. And it's through concepts. But then there's the externalization of it. And that is where signifying comes in. And this is where, if you look at languaging, there's the speaking and the concept of literacy then comes in. And the distinction is literacy is every aspect of the languaging process that doesn't include, it's separate from, distinct, but united with oral speech or speaking. So if we think of literacy as a manifestation of the process, and you can look at the different ways that for humanity, this literacy has been manifest. In gesture, a gesture is a sign. It comes from the animal world, the raising the fur on the back, the blowfish, expanding, making yourself looking bigger, snarling, smiling. And so Vygotsky, we'll see, talks about the gesture is really the acorn to the oak for written language, because it's a symbol. And that symbol then represents something else. And so writing is symbol representing something else. But you look at this different forms of symbolic representation with pictographs, ideographs, the written alphabet, and narratives, the stories, the narratives, art, jewelry, body decoration. And this jewelry and the body decoration goes way back, so that, and this ties into the matrilineal clan, that the relationships that exist amongst members of different tribes were shown by different markings, whether it's a tattoo, or in some cultures they actually cut a piece of skin and that shows a relationship. And jewelry shows relationships, as those of you who are wearing a piece of metal or some substance on that finger is representing something. And then the totem pole. The difference between the internal human conceptual network and the external is, you think in a tribe, every single individual in there has their own conceptual neuronal network. But then through their interactions within the social formation, there becomes a collective, and it wouldn't be neuronal network. It's captured in laws, in beliefs and ways of interacting, as ways of organizing that social formation. And that's developing this human conceptual understanding, which then is knowledge, and that's captured in all different kinds of ways to pass on to further generations. And so this generalization is a huge piece. It's foundational, and it's a difficult thing to understand, and we'll look at that now. So when humans started using individual words to represent objects, they, developed words, and then those words, a concept of these are tools for hunting came. That's a level of abstract thinking. That's generalization. So that, as I mentioned, animals generalize when they gain a concept. They generalize so that any creature coming that's bigger, it's not a specific one, it's a general one. And generalization is moving from a specific, this particular object, to all objects that are captured in that concept. And that's for humans, by using words, that is the key to abstract thinking. And that's a key to development of human consciousness. Well, there's also individual words for cooking. And so these then become tools for cooking. And then another layer of generalization is the concept of tools. So it's not tied to a particular tool or class of category of tools. It's tools as a concept. And so this then brings about a different levels of generality, and you create a system of generality, a system of generalization that's key to this conceptual neuronal network. And that's both individual and social, and it takes place through mutual understanding. And again, we see this is a structure that you'll see, I don't know if you see, you probably won't see it for a few more weeks, but this is a way that I have tried to capture Vygotsky's main central theory in a graphic form. So we'll go over that later. Now, what I'd like for all of you to do is to travel back in time and think about what it would be like for if you were in like 600 BCE, and how would you go about, think about, you know, what the state of human knowledge was at that time, and then think about how would you analyze the universe? How would you analyze thinking? So you want to how we can analyze the universe, life, and human thinking processes. And so you know the routine here, where you will, in your groups,